This week, we are taking on part 2 of Winning the War in Your Mind, a new series which I am personally super excited about as someone that struggles from negative thoughts, anxiety, and all of that not so fun stuff. I am personally really excited to learn more about what God has to say about this in the Bible.
Well, hey there to our Elevate family from wherever it is you're joining us. Great to have you here for week 2 of our brand new series. A special shout out to David up there in Papua New Guinea. Fantastic having you part of our Elevate online family and joining us today. Hey, love to hear from you wherever it is you are joining us from. Just drop us a message in the comments, give us a hey down there and let us know where you're joining in from. Now, looking at me, I know what you're thinking. Boy, this guy is so composed, so wise. You might be surprised to learn that I occasionally make dumb decisions. Yes, people, I occasionally make dumb decisions. Big reveal. And I'm talking about the sorts of decisions that after you've made them and after you've carried out those actions, you look back and at what happened and you think to yourself, what was I thinking? But the point is, you were thinking what you were thinking. I was thinking what I was thinking when I made that dumb decision. And it's no surprise, therefore, that I got the result based on what I was thinking. I got the dumb result based on the dumb decision. The dumb decision was based on some suboptimal thinking. For example, last weekend, I had some drop sheets. You know, these are sort of the canvas sheets you put on the floor and the furniture when you're painting. I had them outside for about 2 weeks to protect part of our concrete driveway, because we're having some retaining walls put in the backyard. And so we had workers going up and down this driveway, pushing trolleys and wheelbarrows and carrying stuff. And they're in their work boots and they're traipsing sand and dirt and rubble all over these drop sheets. And that's the point of the drop sheets. You know, I didn't want that stuff on the concrete, so let's use the drop sheets. Problem is that when the job was complete, this guy thought it was a good idea to take those drop sheets and just pop them into our washing machine. Well, our washing machine didn't like that idea as much as I did. And to no surprise, our washing machine broke. It broke because you're not meant to put soil-filled, muddy, big, heavy canvas drop sheets into your domestic washing machine. And, you know, I told the team here in Perth, I told them that story last weekend, and I went out for lunch with one of our team, a guy named Brando. And Brando says to me, so with the drop sheets, didn't you think about like rinsing them off first? And I said, no, Brandon, I didn't. Huh. But what about just kind of like putting them on your front lawn and like just shaking all the sand off? Didn't you think about that? And I said, no, Brando, I didn't. And then I said, listen, stop with the questions, Brando, because whatever question you ask, which, by the way, these are very good questions. These were not questions that I asked at the point where I had the dumb thought, of just bundling up the drop sheets and putting them in the washing machine. So yeah, it was a dumb decision based on some dumb thinking. But I know I'm not the only one that has dumb thinking that leads to dumb decisions, that leads to dumb outcomes. I mean, you know, some of you do it as well. You've had a hard day at work, and on the drive home, you get your composure and you commit you're going to be very gracious and loving towards your spouse and your kids, and yet 10 minutes in the door, you find yourself yelling. Or maybe you've made a commitment to curb your spending and save money, and then next thing you know, you're kind of adding stuff to your Amazon shopping cart. Or maybe you decided you're going to trust God with something, and yet before you realize, you're just constantly worrying about it, and you can't break it. And that's the point of this series, to really zoom out and think about what you think about. And a recap of last week, a lot of this has to do with how our brains are wired. Now, our brains are wired, one of the key components of how our brains are wired is what are called neural pathways. These are kind of like roads and streets and highways and freeways that exist in our brain, and our thoughts actually travel on those pathways. And the more we think a certain thought or a certain way, those neural pathways become more and more entrenched, and then those very thoughts become our default automatically. That when the next situation or the next occasion where that comes up, our thoughts just travel down the established neural pathways. And ultimately, because our thoughts lead to decisions and our decisions lead to outcomes, what goes on in our minds comes out in our lives. And if what goes on in our minds is less than God's best, then ultimately the pathway and the destination in our life is going to be less than God's best. So we're taking the upstream approach during this series and saying, if your thoughts are less than God's best, let's declare war on them. Let's win the war in our mind. And this is based on a great book by Craig Groeschel, and of course you can grab that and take a much deeper dive into this topic. And it's also a companion message to a companion series to a series we taught in early 2019 called Mastermind, which you can go back onto our podcast and work through that series as well. But if you have an existing thought pattern or more than one existing thought pattern that's less than God's best, in other words, the neural pathways that are established right now around that area are less than God's best, the good news is you can reroute your neural pathways. And ultimately, by doing what Paul defined when he wrote a letter to the church in Rome. This is Paul, one of the entrepreneurial leaders of the early church, writing a letter to the church in Rome. And he talked about this idea of our thoughts being less than God's best, and yet the good news that they can be rerouted is in front of us. And he wrote to that church, and this is for us today as well, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Don't think like the world thinks. Don't settle for thoughts that are just common but less than God's best. But instead be transformed by the renewing of our mind. So what I want to do today is just look at some tools that we have access to that we can use to train our mind so that it's renewed, so that new neural pathways are established. And when we think of training, we're coming up to the Olympics, hopefully. When we think of training, it's easy to kind of immediately think about training the body, and when we're training the body, we put extra focus on what we put into it and how we use it. And those exact same principles apply to training the mind, that we need to put greater focus on what we put into it and how we use it. So grab a device nearby and pop open the Bible app. I'm going to take you to another letter that Paul wrote. This is a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi. So pop your Bible app open to Philippians and to chapter 4. And chapter 4 is like the end of the letter. So I'm going to just kind of drop us into the end of the letter. So he's already written them a bunch of great instruction and encouragement. And here he's kind of landing the plane, Now, before I drop us into this slice from his letter to the church in Philippi, it's important to understand that Paul wrote this from a Roman prison. He was imprisoned writing this letter. And spoiler, this doesn't come across as the sort of letter you'd expect to read from somebody writing from inside a prison. So he's written this letter and now he's landing it, and he writes, summing it all up, friends, I'd say you'll do best. And by the way, whenever like that, hopefully that grabs our attention. I want to do best. Okay, what do I need to do best? Well, you'll do best by filling your minds and meditating on things that are true, noble, reputable, authentic, compelling, gracious, the best, not the worst, the beautiful, not the ugly, things to praise, not things to curse. Do that, here's the promise, people. Do that, and God, in other words, you do that, and God will, who makes everything work together, will work you into His most excellent harmonies. Do that. What's that? That is, fill your minds and meditate. Now, he's got a list. We'll revisit that in a second. But fill your minds and meditate. So let me start with this idea of filling our minds. And again, this is the same analogy as training our body, that it's important as we train our minds to pay greater attention to what we are putting into our minds, what we're feeding our minds, what we're investing into our minds. Fill your minds and meditate. Fill your minds and meditate. Fill your minds. And Paul gives us his top 9 of things to fill our minds with, which, by the way, requires us to also filter out some other stuff. And he gives a couple of those at the end of his top 9. Fill our minds with what's true. Is that really true? Are you sure? Have you checked that? Who said that? Why did you believe that? What's noble? Is this really worthy of the sort of conversation that children of God would have? Do I really need to be reading this, listening to this? Is this what nobility, the sons and daughters of the King of Kings talk about and think about? Is it reputable? Like, who's the source? Where did you get this? Is it authentic? Is it compelling? Is it moving us forward? Is it moving us to where God wants us to be, to becoming who God wants us to become? Or is it actually less than God's best? Is it gracious? You know, you can slam people for this, for that. We've got the cancel culture, but you know, is it gracious? Is the thinking and what we're exposing, what we're filling our minds with, is it gracious? Is it the best and not the worst? So here's Paul starts to talk about the need to filter out some stuff and prioritize letting in some other stuff. Let in the best, filter out the worst. Let in the beautiful, filter out the ugly. Let in the praise and not the curse. And then as this stuff gets into our minds, it's not a one-off. Paul talks about filling our minds and meditating. Now, I'm aware that some people are terrified by the concept of meditation, or maybe push back against the concept of meditation because they kind of equate it with New Age or Eastern mysticism, and you know, it's about emptying your minds, and meditation can take that form. But Paul's encouragement about meditating isn't about emptying our minds. It's about filling our minds with things like his top 9 and meditating on those things. Meditating, thinking about them over and over and over. And one of the words that can be used to describe what this form of meditation looks like, where you're actually intentionally filling your minds with something and then turning that over, is called rumination. And rumination is something that cows do. Cows who are meant to eat grass only, eat that grass, chew it for a little while, start to break it down. It's not easy because it's fibrous, and so then they pass it down into one of their 4 stomach chambers, turn it over there for a little while, the acids start to break it down further. Then they bring it up in the form of what's called a cud, and they start chewing on their cud. Now, I'm not going to show you the YouTube videos about this. They're kind of cute. or kind of gross, depending on your perspective. I'll leave that one with you to look up on YouTube if you dare. But they ruminate. They just turn this thing over and over and over and over and get the goodness and the nutrition out of it over a period of time. They fill themselves with something and then they ruminate on that very same thing. Interestingly, rumination in psychology is actually most of the time it's given a very bad rap. And the reason it's given a bad rap is because it's equated with turning over, thinking repetitively about negative stuff, worrying, stressing. And in that very perspective, psychologists are actually recognizing the power of rumination. And yet they're obviously shining the spotlight and saying the sorts of things that we ruminate on matter. And if they're negative things, then they're destructive. But this cuts both ways. This very idea of us filling our minds with things like Paul's top 9 and ruminating on them is incredibly powerful as well, and yet powerful in a very constructive way, powerful in a way that creates new neural pathways that are more like God's best. And if we do the work, if we ingest the good stuff, if we filter out the bad stuff, and if we continue to ruminate on the good stuff, the God's best stuff, then God says, do that, and He will work you into His most excellent harmonies. Wow. Now, last week, in the first week of our series, I ran some diagnostics about how we can maybe identify if we're currently thinking or have thought patterns that are less than God's best. And one of the diagnostics was the scenario, when I, then I, and inserting blanks into those. When I experience this situation, when I'm in this setting, when I, whatever it is, then my thoughts default currently in this direction. And I have that going on in my life as well. Now, I'm generally a pretty optimistic, upbeat, positive, faith-filled person, but I occasionally have some negative thoughts that are a little bit default, that are a bit of a when I, then I. And for me, it happens on Mondays. Now, I'm not talking about the classic Monday-itis or, I don't like Mondays. I do like Mondays most of the time. For me, as a church leader, Mondays, I kind of, do some evaluation, which is critical. It's important. You've got to evaluate, evaluate game day, evaluate what happened, evaluate areas for improvement, evaluate the wins and celebrate them, and look for ways that we might be able to do things more effectively. And all of that's super important and super healthy. But if I'm not on guard, if I don't have the filters on, if I'm not aware or on high alert over my thoughts, then what happens is, hey, if our numbers live and our numbers online have been up, if we've gotten great feedback, if we had a great sense of God's presence, then I'm up on a Mondays. When I have a good evaluation session, then I feel upbeat and positive, and Mondays are just flying along. However, if we have a day where we haven't hit all of the high points, haven't hit all of our goals, numbers were down a little bit, or we didn't have many first-time guests, or there just wasn't a lot of energy, or any of the key metrics, if they were down a little bit, when I hit that, then I can start to have a very dark Monday, a very bleak Monday, a very horrible, negative thinking Monday. And because I'm aware of that, because I know that happens, I've had to develop some pushback. I've had to develop an alternative strategy so that I don't just kind of go down this dark, slippery slope of negative thinking on these Mondays. And I use what Craig Groeschel calls the replacement principle. The replacement principle is, simply stated, is to take the lie, take the thought that's less than God's best, and replace it with God's truth. And this is not a new approach. In fact, this was kind of showcased at its absolute best by Jesus himself, where Jesus had gone into the desert. He fasted for 40 days, preparing to go public at the age of 30 as the Son of God. And he was preparing himself and everything to get ready for that. And the devil showed up at the end of the 40 days. Jesus had been fasting. And the devil hit Jesus with 3 lies. If you do this, if you do this, if you do this. And in all 3 cases, Jesus used what Craig Groeschel calls the replacement principle. He heard the devil's lie. He wasn't in denial. He knew it was coming. He heard what it was. And he pushed back on the devil with God's truth. I'm not going to buy into your lie because here's the truth. He had filled his mind and had been meditating on God's truth. And so it was there when he needed to replace the lie with the truth. So I want to finish today with just take you to 3 of the replacements that Craig Groeschel outlines in his book, which I think, well, they are enormously helpful if you do the work and put in the time. So here they are. Maybe you're struggling to know God's specific will, and you've bought the lie that you're never going to know his will, and even if you do stumble across it, you're never going to be good enough, you're never going to be able to achieve it. And that's a lie, people. But it's a lie that can get inside our heads and start to influence and inform our thinking if we leave it unchecked. And so the replacement principle says, well, what's the truth that we can actually meditate, fill our minds with, and meditate that's going to replace the lie with God's truth? Well, it might look something like this. You get a hold of the truth that my life belongs to God. Daily, I seek him, and daily, he directs my steps. I know his voice, and he leads me into his perfect will. Or maybe your lie is around lacking confidence, that when opportunities come up, you just duck and cover. When you think of a good idea, you just crop yourself out and assume that you couldn't never pull it off. So replace that lie with God's truth. My confidence is in Jesus because his Holy Spirit lives in me. I can do everything he calls me to do. I can't do everything, but I can do everything he calls me to do. Or final one, maybe your neural pathways and your current thought patterns find you constantly battling worry. And you don't want to, and you don't like it, but you're kind of stuck there. And so it's important, it's vital, if you want to get out of that and reroute your neural pathways to replace the lie that worry is going to consume you with God's truth. Because of Jesus, I'm not anxious about anything. I cast my cares on God because he cares for me. And I have the peace of God dwelling in my heart and ruling my mind. Now, those are just 3 examples. The list goes on, but look, hey, if any of those 3 examples resonated with you, just a little pro tip. The slide deck for all of our messages, you can find them on our website, elevatechurch.me. Go to the media tab, and they'll be there. So if you think, oh, I missed that, you can go there and write them down, because the great news is that you have a notes app on your smartphone. So you can take any of the lies and make a note about it. Battling worry, yeah, that's me. So write I'm battling worry, and when I do, here's the truth that I'm going to replace that lie with, and write them out. And every time you find yourself battling worry, pop open your smartphone, pop open that note, and read it, and start declaring that, and start to replace God's truth into the space that lie is occupying in your brain. We can reroute our thinking. This is something I read again from Paul in last week's message. We use our powerful God tools for smashing warped philosophies, tearing down barriers erected against the truth of God, fitting every loose thought and emotion and impulse into the structure of a life shaped by Christ. Friends, it is possible to win the war in your mind. It's going to take work. It's going to take time, but the promise is there. The work and the time will be worth it. The rewards are waiting for you. So I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we're able to be on this journey together. And I'm already looking forward to next week where we continue this series, Winning the War in Your Mind. Hey, by the way, our team are in the chat. If you want to interact with us, we'd love to hear from you. You know, we're in this together. We're a family, and make sure you reach out to them if you need to do that. But in the meantime, we will see you next week for week 3 of our Winning the War in Your Mind series.